Welcome back to another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. I am James Yost, partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Travis York, owner of 3-1 Advisors. Travis, how are you?
I'm doing great today, James. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Welcome back to another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Your hosts, James Yost and Travis York, as always. Travis, what do we got on the docket today?
James, we're here today with Ben Pate from Lakefield Veterinary. We are super excited to have him. But this may be a little bit different episode. As I kind of look over and see you taking a sip of bourbon, we probably better tell our listeners why we're having a drink while we're doing a podcast.
There you go. Fill them in.
Well, so we are fortunate here to have Ben with us, and not only does he have a whole depth of experience in the veterinary space, he also knows bourbon probably almost better than anybody else out there.
Little bourbon aficionado over here.
Now we're cooking. There we go.
Rumor is you had a podcast and just talked about bourbon, right?
Once upon a time, yes. Back in COVID. We'll jump into that here in a little bit.
There you go.
That's legendary. Well, we are excited, obviously, because we're hopefully maybe going to learn a little bit about bourbon, but most importantly, Ben, you've had an incredible kind of run in the veterinary space. You and I share a lot in common. Started out, both of us grew up in our dad's veterinary hospital.
Couple vet kids. Can't do anything else with us.
No, I'm guessing you may have locked yourself in a cage a couple of times along the way.
Nice. Best free tech at 3 a.m. on an emergency call.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to exchange stories on that at some point in time. But you took that and you serve the veterinary community in roles at Patterson, obviously come from an experience of having been in a hospital for 40 plus years now, as well as at this point in time, you're working with a group that is bringing different hospitals together in Lakefield. So I'd be happy to talk about your background, but maybe just share with our listeners a little bit about your experience in the veterinary space.
All right, thanks, Travis. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you all for having me. Talking about two things: passionate about veterinary medicine and bourbon.
Which one are you more passionate about?
Oh boy, the hot seat already. We just got started, Travis.
I've been around veterinary medicine longer, but I probably invested more into bourbon, much to my wife's chagrin.
It just makes me feel good to know that you weren't drinking bourbon at 10.
Well,
Well, it probably was, but let's be honest.
Only on Wednesdays.
Yeah.
But no, thanks. Grew up in a veterinary household, just like you. So been around it my whole life. Never in a million years, when I left to go off to college, did I think I would work in the veterinary sector. Would have laughed you out of a room if you had told me I was going to be working with veterinarians. It just wasn't my thing back then. Right?
The rumor is you were going to be a rock star, but maybe that's another time, another place.
Some would say he achieved that feat too. What's the threshold?
Moved to Nashville, got to work in the music industry a little bit. It was loads of fun. Then, one thing leads to another. Figured out I didn't want to live on a tour bus my whole life. And some opportunities opened up in the veterinary world. Really, at that point, I was thinking more going into the human side. I knew growing up, probably like you, I met my dad's reps and people like that and got really close to some folks and just thought that was like the mecca job you could have. It's just taking people to lunch all day. That's all you did. And so there was this side of me I've always been a social person. This idea of being able to work with people every single day, not sit in a cubicle, kind of be out and about. So I was looking at going to the human side, and I had a contact that I knew through my dad on the veterinary side who told me, hey, look, talk to some people on the human side, but talk to people on the veterinary side too. We've got a position over here at Patterson. When everybody basically told me, I talked to 8 people, 7 out of 8 told me to go veterinary side. That included all the human reps. So opportunity opened up at Patterson. I was there for a little over 10 years. A year ago, January 1st of last year, took the leap and came over to Lakefield. I work in business development now, so perfect opportunity to learn a different area of the business and an area of the business that's certainly evolving where we are as an industry today.
Awesome. Well, I guess I just kind of tease up. I guess if I'm a listener, I may be kind of wondering, why did this episode start with James taking a sip of his bourbon and everybody raising a quick sip of bourbon?
Cheers.
There you go. Cheers.
Cilantro. Bourbon for the working man. There you go.
But, this idea of this podcast came out of you and I sitting down one night, probably over a drink, and you looking at me saying, you're doing this podcast, and veterinary consolidation and bourbon aren't that different. And I know at that point in time, you probably had three eyes,
right?
Maybe another ear. But, I'll just kind of throw it back in your court. Why throw that at me? You got me intrigued, and we never answered that question. So that's what we're here to solve today.
I think selfishly, I just wanted to be on a podcast.
And you knew you had me at bourbon.
Yes. So everybody likes bourbon. No, it's something that kind of just dawned on me as I'm getting into the consolidation business, and have been in the bourbon collection world for a while. I don't so much sell, but the buy-sell trade. Bourbon world, bourbon's blown up. I mean, it's insane. It's insane what bourbon used to be, and used to be able to find it all on the shelf. Used to be able to walk in and buy a Blanton's or a E.H. Taylor or maybe even a Pappy. And today you can't find any of that. Usually the only way you find it is to go to the secondary market where stuff's been majorly inflated. And watching that rise for the past 6 or 7 years, and now watching with kind of market changes and where we're at now, people's wallets are getting tighter, and that's changing a bit. It's that industry is changing. It's becoming more available. What does that sound a lot like for the past 6 or 7 years? It kind of sounds like people selling their veterinary practice. It used to be that you worked your entire career. Maybe you had an associate, and you made a deal with that associate to buy you out. And that was great. That's what my dad did. I'm sure that's what your dad did. And there are still veterinarians that have that opportunity to do that. But investors saw an opportunity to come in and invest into a business that's still largely cash, is relationship-based. And they saw an opportunity to invest in a business where people spend money on their animals, sometimes before they do themselves. So we've seen the veterinary consolidation world kind of mirror the bourbon world, where it's just been this massive craze.
I think you summed it up, right? People spend money on their pets before they spend money on themselves, and people spend money on their bourbon before they spend money on themselves.
Yeah, no doubt.
No, I love that. It's a great high-level framework for kind of where this conversation is going to go, which is fantastic. But you had mentioned your expertise in bourbon. Let's talk a little bit about the bourbon podcast that you had. Just give us a little background on the podcast, what you were doing, how it started, what your experience was like, and then we thought it'd be fun just to kind of start off with an easy one, a little lesson for our listeners here on just the difference between bourbon and whiskey and the distinction, because I think that's something that people probably get wrong frequently.
We'll definitely do that. So Finer Sips, my podcast, really was a product of being bored at home during the 8 weeks of time where Patterson had us not being on the road during the peak of COVID. So starting in March of 2020, like I said, I have this creative gene side of me. I don't like to sit still. And so I'm sitting at home. When I was a rep at Patterson, I was out all day, every day in clinics talking to people. And all of a sudden I found that, I kept my route the same, even though I wasn't riding or physically there in a route. I would call the same people at the same time, in the same order, on the same day. But then you realize, okay, I can do 10 phone calls in an hour and a half. And so you're done at 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. Sorry, Patterson. It's not the whole rest of your day. And you can do an entire week's worth of work like before lunch. And so quite frankly, I was bored. And so I needed to exercise a creative gene. I had been a guest on podcasts before talking about whiskey, not specifically bourbon, but Scotch and bourbon and rye. What are these differences? And we talked about wine on one. Really enjoyed that. So I said, you know what? I'm going to start an Instagram page, and I'm going to pair it with a podcast. And I'm going to do it all myself, see how it goes.
How many episodes did you have?
6.
Okay.
6 episodes. They're all, originally I started it wanting to dive in kind of what we're drinking today, and we'll get into that in a minute, which is a small batch collection from Jim Beam. This is just really, really interesting. But then started having guests on, and it's so much easier to do a podcast, as y'all know, when you have a guest and you're not just looking at a wall. And it's much less scripted. So started doing that, realized that it takes a massive amount of time, not just us sitting here talking and then
producing this. It's doing the actual production of it. It's mixing it and splicing it and publishing it and advertising it. And it was a ton of time. So when the world somewhat went back to normal and we got back on the road, it just wasn't time enough to do podcasts. But to this day, almost 3 years later, I'm still doing my Instagram blog, building back up a good fan base there, follower base. And it's just fun.
And for the listeners that are for the listeners who are experiencing any sort of FOMO or anything, we are going to do an event at some point at our office to do a bourbon tasting. Yeah. So that'd be fun to have you back. We'll see how today goes, but based on what I know, you're the most learned person I've encountered in the whiskey side. So I think you're our guy for that.
Yeah, it's going to go great, or you never allow me back in the building. So it's one or the other.
So back to the difference between bourbon and whiskey.
Yeah. So there's kind of the famous saying that all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. You can spell that with a Y or an EY. It really doesn't matter. Whiskey is whiskey. But bourbon, as all different types of whiskeys have, it has earmarks that you have to hit in order to be in that category. The first one is it has to be made here in the United States. It used to be that it had to be made in Kentucky. And most bourbon purists would still like their bourbon to be made in Kentucky. Surprisingly, one of my favorites right now is not made in Kentucky, but I do fall in that category of I like my stuff to be out of Kentucky. It needs to be 51% corn. So why is bourbon sweet? Scotch is not. Well, bourbon's made with a lot of corn, and corn is naturally sweet. It has to be housed and barreled in new, charred American white oak barrels. So brand new. Couldn't have ever housed anything else. And then largely those barrels are shipped off to Scotland, and Scotch is put in them a lot of times. And it has to be at least 80 proof when it comes out. So you can't have anything under 80 proof.
What about age?
4 years would be the bottled and bond technical youngest you can go. There are bourbons out there that are younger than 40, some new called bourbons. But then you go up as old as, well into the 20s. And we can talk age statements and stuff like that. I would tell you anything past 15 years, probably you're paying for just storage, basically. But yeah, so
just dive in a little bit, because you said it used to be, it had to be Kentucky to be bourbon. Now, like, your favorite bourbon is not from Kentucky.
Yeah, a lot of mine.
So what changed? Obviously this kind of speaks to evolution of everything, right? Things evolve, but what evolved that just allowed somebody else to sneak in that wasn't Kentucky?
I think just the bourbon craze got. So if you look at kind of the path of bourbon becomes massive during Prohibition. Because everything pre-Prohibition was largely rye whiskey. Everybody had rye whiskey. Rye is extremely easy to make because its main ingredient is rye. You grow it everywhere. Corn is not grown everywhere. But really, Prohibition to the 1970s, bourbon dominated medicinally. It dominated in bars and kind of the pop culture scene. Vodka took over in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And then we had this phenomenon of a TV show in the 2000s come out called Mad Men. And Mad Men is Don Draper as an ad man in the 1960s. And there were two vices, all of a sudden came real prominent again. One of them was bourbon, because Don Draper drank old fashions and smoked cigarettes. And so you saw a climb in bourbon sales, saw a climb in cigarette sales. And so it's this pop culture phenomenon where bourbon became cool again. And you have all these companies wanting to jump in, sound like something else we might be talking about, that wanted to get in on that. And so all of a sudden they said, okay, well, if we're not in Kentucky, we'll still follow all the guidelines and we can label it bourbon.
And you like it kind of solves the supply crisis situation. Like you can expand to the continental 48 or whatever the specific limitations are, which is awesome. So like thinking about bourbon. So, I mean, a good bourbon, based on what you're saying here, it's talking about some of the ingredients. It's bringing together a lot of different things, sometimes introducing different flavors that you can identify. I'm assuming somebody like you could identify. So how does that same concept hold true in the consolidation space of bringing together a lot of different pieces to maybe create one thing that's better than all the parts separately.
Yeah, no doubt. So kind of what we're referring to there in bourbon speak is a mash bill, right? So your ingredient, your corn, your malted barley, your wheat, or your rye, all that in percentages mixed together, aged, gives you a tasty bourbon or a really bad bourbon, one or the other. And yeah, the same can be true in veterinary corporate consolidation. We're all made up of our own unique mash bills, which I would call kind of your different departments in that company and where they put their concentrations. So like recruiting comes top of mind.
Yeah.
If you're talking to a company and their number one thing is not recruiting right now, might be a red flag.
Yeah.
Because there's this huge demand for veterinarians. There's not a vet clinic that I have talked to the last year that is not actively looking for veterinarians. So recruiting, HR, mergers and acquisitions, business development, regional field teams, kind of et cetera on that, but how they delegate responsibility to each team and how they delegate time to each team. So I think it's really, really important. And, there's a different bourbon for every palate out there. There is a different possible consolidation partner for every practice out there. You have to find the one that finds what they think is important and matches what you think is important.
So maybe that just kind of ties back to is, we started pouring these bourbons and, getting our thing going. James looks at me and goes, so like, how do you want it? You want it deep? You want it rocks?
Right.
Obviously bourbon gets served a lot of different ways.
Yep.
What do you think are some of the different ways that veterinary consolidators are I hate to say serving, but just kind of keeping connection? How are they serving the services that they offer to your clients? And maybe I'll ask you where your Patterson hat in answering this question when you were inside of hospitals and working.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that corporate consolidators do a really good job on, especially on the back end, once the deal is done, is, and tell me if I'm going off from your question, but I think the number one thing you see is running a business. We a lot of times look at veterinarians and say, well, they're business owners, they got this. And I can say this because I'm raised by one of them. Most veterinarians aren't great business people. They are great at medicine, great at diagnosing, at cutting, especially things that don't talk back to you. That is their forte. But for most of them, running a business, it's not their forte. And so to me, that's an extremely powerful thing when you get a partner with a consolidator. And something I would see almost immediately when I was a rep is ordering gets more streamlined, your payroll gets more streamlined, your HR gets more streamlined. A lot of times the way you market yourself is a lot more streamlined because you have a group of professionals doing that for you. And it's not that you're paying them to do it for you, it's you're a part of that family now. So again, kind of to James's question is you have to find that right mix of what they find is important. Because if you go partner with a company, and I'm not speaking of anybody specifically, but you say, okay, XYZ company over here, they are great at marketing and HR. You don't ever have to worry about talking to another employee again, firing an employee, coaching one, hiring one. They're great at it. But they spend no time on recruitment. They spend no time on M&A. They spend no time on improvements. Okay, then you just partnered with a company who talks to your employees for you, not getting anything else out of that.
If we're talking improvements and bringing it back to your bourbon expertise, is the ice on my bourbon, is that an improvement? Is your bourbon served neat? What's the impact from a bourbon perspective on those changes, and then how does that tie back to veterinary medicine and how things change?
Great question. So no, both of y'all have ice in your bourbon. I love that. Most people
I told you that confidence, man.
Right. James, strike one. No, I mean, my biggest thing is I really don't care who you are or what you're drinking, just drink it the way you want. So spirits are made to be enjoyed. If you're not enjoying it, no real point in drinking it. I have graduated through a number of years of, finally been able to drink whiskey. And I used to mix it with ginger ale. All right, that was the greatest thing ever. And then it went from ginger ale to lots of rocks and a little water and some bourbon. Then it was take away the water and just do the rocks. And then it went from rocks to one rock, one big rock. Then slowly from there to neat. And largely for me, why I drink it neat is I'm kind of trying to become what you would call a bourbon sommelier. There's no such thing as a whiskey sommelier, but kind of the same idea as a wine sommelier. Is being able to pick notes and flavors. We know that when we start adding water, that dilutes our alcohol proof, and we do that with super high proof whiskeys just to open them up and get different flavor profiles. Typically, when you do ice in bourbon, it dilutes some of the flavor because it chills it, so it mutes some of that. But again, if that's how you enjoy it, drink it. Find what you enjoy and go after it. The same's true in veterinary medicine. And I think we'll probably get into taking your time a little bit later and kind of the path of talking to some consolidators. But again, it's not one answer is not everybody's answer, if you will. One way is not
it's not a one size fits all to practice. So you had just mentioned the bourbon, how it takes time in order to qualify as a bourbon. I think you said 4 years is kind of the industry standard. And then at some point, maybe it drops off and you're not really getting the bang for your buck. In your time in Patterson, I'm sure you spent a ton of time with different hospital owners and saw the progression, whether it was from startup to corporate sale or startup to 10 docs, whatever the situation is. I'm sure you spent a lot of time just watching that growth progression. So how do you kind of relate that back to the bourbon thing when you have to have patience, you have to have discipline, you have to have time for something beautiful to be created?
Yes, no doubt. So kind of, again, relating that back to what I'm doing now, which is going in and partnering with veterinarians and helping them with transitions. I think the number one sin of what we see a lot of folks doing is they feel undue pressure to make a real quick decision, a rash decision, and they don't take their time. They talk to maybe one company or two companies, and one of those companies says, look, if you don't make a decision next week, you're going to miss a recap opportunity, and then it's all gone. So if you want to make money, you got to do it now. And I disagree with that take 100%. You have to remember that what I want to buy is yours. It is your creation. It's your baby. It's what you have shown up every single day of your career to work towards making successful. It's what you've connected with the community. It's a place where you have given people jobs. And so it should be the last thing that a rush decision is made about. You're only doing yourself a favor to take your time, meet with numerous groups. And this is somebody who works for one and competes with all the other ones. I'm telling you, you got to talk to 5 to 6 groups. If you're not, you're doing yourself a disservice. And if any of them at any point say, look, you got to make a decision right now or we're out, I'd probably let that one walk because they're not willing to give you the time that you put into this practice. The same is true with bourbon whiskey. Your guys, Jim Beam, we're drinking a Beam product, Baker's, which Baker's at a minimum is aged for 7 years. This particular bottle is aged for 8 years, 2 months. And so they literally put whiskey in barrels and then just wait. And they have this formula, depending on what flavor profile you're going for, what market you're going for, is that return you get is worth that wait. You have younger whiskeys to tide that time and give you something to sell. But the market, like, say, a lot of folks like an older aged spirit. It's smoother. It's what you think about when you think about drinking a whiskey on a cool winter's evening or something like that. It's not your white label Evan Williams for $16.
So just kind of quick question, because that makes me think about something that's been bouncing around in my head around veterinary medicine, right? It's obviously there's a lot of news today going on in veterinary medicine, and fluctuations and change, and is it good, is it bad? What I'm hearing from you is if you want to get in the bourbon business, you better be playing the long game.
Yeah.
Like it's not a short game, right? Like if you want the short game, like go make beer and turn it around in 72 hours or whatever that time period is. How do you kind of think that like that play that long game applies to veterinary medicine?
Yeah. So again, I mean, I think if you're a veterinarian, you're obviously passionate about it. You've gone through the schooling, you've taken the time to get there, and when you get to be a practice owner, the last thing I think you should be thinking about in those first few years is how am I going to sell my practice? There is always a good mindset to constantly be thinking about transition and where you're at in that stage, but building something that is truly a staple in the community for me and how I evaluate practices is worth so much more than being, the young guy on the street who's had an overnight success and all of a sudden wants to unload it. Because then for me, I'm looking more of, okay, why do you want to get out? Are you getting out to go do it again down the street? Now we're competing with each other. Is it just about the money? Which some companies, that's great. They're companies for those people. I don't work for one of those. We put a lot of value in time you spend in a practice, and for us, it makes that much more valuable.
That's awesome. I mean, you're digging into the folklore question. So you had mentioned like a veteran, from your perspective, and this is the way I think about it too. Like most veterinarians become a staple in their community. They're part of the folklore of that city or town. So tying it back into bourbon, I mean, there's obviously a lot of folklore around bourbon in America, which for better or for worse drives a lot of hype to it. And it's good marketing for that. So why don't you talk a little bit about, historical bourbon folklore in America, and then if that is any comparison to how veterinarians have been viewed at some point in time in America with respect to our folklore as well.
Yes, I mean, obviously the folklore of bourbon would be your bourbon drink, right? Your original folks, your Elijah Craig, your Jim Beams, even your Woodfords and your Bakers, just the original group there. And some of the folklore is that bourbon is your grandfather's drink, or is some drink that just old aristocratic white guys drink. And it's not. There's been disruptors in the bourbon industry through pop culture, through different brands coming in. I know off stage we talked a little bit about Black, right, which is kind of a startup company that's partnered with Willet. During the end of their distillation process, they play, who is it?
Metallica.
In words, which I think is awesome. Does them playing Metallica make that whiskey taste any different from anything else? No, but they through this.
Now we're going to get sued by. Now they're going to sue us for that. So thank you.
But I mean, I've tried Black. I had it about a year ago, and it's fantastic. Is it the bourbon that probably my caliber drinker is looking for? No. But is it if you're a big rock and roll fan and you want to drink some whiskey, that's what you're going
for. There's sentimentality to it.
It feels like it ties back to your point, right? It's like enjoyment.
Yeah.
It's like, however you enjoy it,
find what you
enjoy it.
And that's the cool thing about the bourbon market right now is moving away from this kind of classic folklore of you have to be on the bourbon trail. You have to be kind of part of that old guard. And now you have companies, I referenced them earlier, a company called Smoke Wagon. They're out of Las Vegas, Nevada. And they have turned the industry upside down because they're taking your classic rituals of distilling bourbon and they're throwing all of these new flavors and nuances at it. And they're just rolling the stuff out pretty quickly with just little bitty changes. But you get these robust flavor profiles and it keeps a guy like me going back. They're not, I'm a Kentucky bourbon purist, but I love Smoke Wagon just with what they're doing. They're being a little bit different. They're doing great advertisement and it's brought them massive success. Now, does Maker's Mark need to do massive advertisement? No, because anybody who drinks bourbon knows what Maker's Mark is. Their advertisement is the melted wax. Does Woodford Reserve, does Jack Daniels, does Jim Beam need to do massive advertisement? No, But that's the old guard. That's the folklore.
And how do you connect that, right? Like there's a folklore, and you and I have talked about it, right? You probably grew up in those small communities where there was a little folklore with veterinary hospitals in those communities. How does that tie into veterinary medicine and, some of the, who is the smoke wagons out there now, and what does that mean for the industry?
Well, if any industry has seen disruption from classic folklore, I think it's veterinary medicine. It's changed so drastically just in the last 7 to 10 years. It's largely been tied down, and for many good ways. It used to be that veterinarians, kind of as you and I talked, were your pillars of the community, your most trusted people out there. The guy you called at 3 a.m. when your dog was vomiting, or you had a cow that was bloated, and they came to your house. Veterinarians didn't get a lot of sleep, didn't get a lot of vacation. You were constantly working, and I can
attest to that.
Yeah, I can too. I mean, my dad still works like crazy. He takes a couple days to go play golf, which is unheard of back in the day. But that mindset of, you're always on, even if you're not at the hospital, you're on call. That's largely gone now. It's gone for several disruptors. I would say the first one is just technology alone. 20 years ago, you didn't get an MRI on your dog. Now you do. I mean, people spend crazy money getting advanced imaging, ultrasounds, x-rays, CTs, MRIs. We're using C-arms in surgery, doing laparoscopic, arthroscopic procedures on dogs and cats, just like they do on humans. And largely it's because it can relate to us mentally. What happens if you blow your ACL? All right, I'm going to get an MRI. Well, if your dog blows its cruciate, that's what they're going to do now. They're going to do that same thing. So we understand that. So that's been one large, I think, disruptor in the veterinary world that it's changed that. It's gone from our dads who were taught to literally see every case that came in the door. And now you're not taught that in school. You're taught for very little unless you want to go be a specialist. And it's following the way of the human world. We have veterinary dermatologists and veterinary ophthalmologists and surgeons and internists and emergency medicine specialists. So that's been huge. I think corporate entities coming into the market have been another massive disruptor, in many ways for the good. You've been able to give back to veterinarians that have given their everything to this industry and given them some reward for that in a monetary way. But it's also opened the door for people who don't want to be practice owners to be able to be a chief medical officer, have some leadership in a practice and not have to have all of the responsibility, or be able to partner with somebody to further your education and become that specialist. Or even if you're not the vet and you're an assistant and you want to become an LVT, but maybe you can't afford that company helping you do that. So I think that's all been good. It's bringing in fresh blood. It's bringing in new ideas. So yeah, I mean, those are the smoke wagons of the veterinary world, if you will.
I love that. That's awesome. So earlier you were talking about proof when speaking about bourbon.
Yes.
Talking about the potency and the strength of the whiskey. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna try to win the cheesiest pun of the podcast. So let's talk about how something could be recession proof.
All right.
And that right now, every news outlet you turn on, everyone's talking about a pending recession. We had our chief investment officer on a few episodes ago to talk about how this recession, if there is one, could be pretty fragmented amongst industries, and that some industries could be recession proof.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about how bourbon does historically, and then also how veterinary medicine typically goes as well?
So the bourbon side of things is a little more depressing side of things. Is typically when you see a recession, you see alcohol sales spike. And bourbon is one of those because people want some comfort, be that comfort food, be that comfort drink. You got to do something that makes you happy. And generally during times like these, turning on the news, doesn't always do that. So yeah, we see alcohol sales grow through the roof. By the same time, we're in a recession with inflation. People's pockets are tighter. So what you're not seeing is people going to spend big money on bottles, where for the past 5 to 7 years, you had guys amassing these huge collections. It wasn't attainable for everybody, and then you had to go buy it from them. We're not seeing that so much anymore. You're still seeing some of it, but that secondary price has largely come down. It's a lot like veterinary medicine. I have told people before that I think veterinary medicine is recession-proof because we have seen it do fine through recession. It is not inflation-proof, however. You'll keep the lights on, but you won't be as profitable, and your revenue will not be as good. Because all right, so going back to being a Patterson rep, I wanted everybody to buy 6 and 12 months of preventative, so I can sell more to the veterinarian.
Yeah.
It's good medicine, right? Compliance is good. That's what you should be doing. And when the economy's good and people have some money in their pocket, buying 6 to 12 months is a no-brainer. You get a little rebate. You don't have to go back to the veterinarian every single month. Good to go. When you're in a recession with a large amount of inflation, with what we're seeing now, veterinarians don't see that anymore. If their clients are buying preventative medication, it's a month at a time, actually. Largely the if is gone with extra care, dental, where we've seen dentals go down in the last year, where your dental for veterinary medicine is massive, but it's largely seen as an extra.
Well, I think it's not that vastly different from bourbon, right? Like,
No.
there's always an interest in bourbon.
Correct.
I just might be willing to drink a bottle that costs $30
That's right.
in a tight time, where when the world's flowing and going, I may buy a $100 bottle.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So let's relate it to an actual bottle here. So yeah, when I've got a dog, obviously I take my dog to the vet. I know what to do, and I'm not going to stop taking my dog to the vet, even if I'm not connected to the veterinary industry. I'm just not probably willing to do all the fluff, if you will, and it's not fluff, but extra in there. Just like I love bourbon, obviously. When times are good, yeah, you have a little more security to go out and buy that nicer bottle. Where if times are tight, maybe I'm going to go buy a bottle of Old Granddad. And Old Granddad is $23, and it is incredible, by the way. But
that might just be flag that best tip of the show.
that's value. Go get Old Granddad. But yeah, so I mean, I think it largely revolves around what the world is doing. I think, like I said, both are recession-proof, but not both are inflation.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think one of the things that just came out when we were talking here is a good veterinarian is typically extremely knowledgeable, unbelievable skill set, but they have a very good way of distilling that down to talk to people like myself, who has 2 dogs and 3 cats. They can simplify a lot of complex things and present it to you in a way that makes a lot of sense and makes you feel good about it.
Sure.
I feel like you have done a great job as someone who has incredibly deep knowledge of bourbon to distill it down to a level where Travis and I can keep up in a way that it's not intimidating. Because I think a lot of people's challenge with bourbon, especially lately, because of the boom, has just been unbelievable,
Right.
is there so many bourbon aficionados out there that they're hesitant to kind of get involved because it seems like it's just very intimidating. There's a lot going on. So that's just one thing that I thought of when we were sitting here today.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll give it back to Travis to wrap us up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, where we started now, that third eye's gone, the year's gone, it's all gone back in your head. I mean, there's a clear, distinct, whether it be we're talking about, economy impacts on it, whether we're talking about bringing a bunch of things together that don't always, seem to fit together, that
Sure.
make a great fit. Talking about age, there's so much in common here. It probably is applicable to a lot of things in life. I'm just glad we were lucky enough to have the time to spend with somebody who understands both so well and has the ability to break it down for us, so that we can walk away and these two things really are the same or very similar. So hopefully for some of our veterinarians, maybe they're ambitious now to go dive in and maybe give bourbon a shot.
Absolutely.
If they're interested, they can still follow your Instagram page,
Yeah.
right? Finer Sips.
Finer Sips, one word.
Which maybe that's your advice, but we always kind of wrap the show up in with with a, kind of a quote. It's a quote that we love.
Sure.
Hangs over the toilet in some places that, everyone wants to change the world. No one wants to change the toilet paper.
No doubt.
So do you sneak out of the bathroom after you've used the last square of toilet paper and just hope somebody else catches it? Or do you always make sure and change that toilet paper? And we'll verify with your wife.
I'm throwing another roll in there.
That was firm. I guess probably the firm. No doubt.
I have a picture, and this may be TMI, but it's a great story. I was in the Atlanta airport too long ago. It's in the morning. I'm in the Delta Club, had a little coffee, trying to get my morning routine done, go to use the restroom. And I realized there's no toilet paper in the stall. That's a terrible feeling.
Not a good place to have that.
Terrible. They had to work up the courage, knock on the stall next to the squares.
Oh boy.
Pass the square every year. But yeah, I'm throwing another roll on there. Before we get done, can we do one thing?
He's got one more question.
One more question, and then we'll wrap it up on the end. So the way we always part is you're kind of given the floor. Obviously, we didn't talk a whole lot about changing the world. This kind of ties into some other ones, but you do have the floor to share your one piece of advice for the veterinary community that, how do they want to make a difference? How do they actually change the world? Not only change the toilet paper roll, but change the world.
Yeah. I think the veterinary community does change the world, does impact the world every single day by educating your community on your animals' health needs. We said it earlier, your animals can't talk to you, right? So I kind of relate it back to being somewhat knowledgeable on picking out flavors from bourbon. I've had countless number of times where I'm posting something or I'm explaining a flavor profile to somebody, and I'll say, let's find that nutty note in there. That's this hint of spiced vanilla or green peppercorn or something like that, and they're looking at you like BS. Like, okay, I taste old shoe in there. Sure, Ben. But if you're willing to sit there and ask and listen and figure out how you go through those layers, you can learn something. And that's my encouragement to the veterinary community is continue educating your communities on why it's important to spay and neuter your dogs and cats and get vaccines and get on preventative. Keep educating them on why it's important to clean your dog's teeth. Could you imagine if you never went to the dentist? How like your dog or your cat? So you have to put it into your own thought process. And I think that's largely the job of the veterinary community to figure out how to relay that to the human owner who doesn't see or pick up on everything the veterinarian does. And to the dog and cat owner out there who might be listening, trust your veterinarian. Go see them. Ask questions. If you don't understand it, tell them that. They will find a way to explain it to you, whether it's the veterinarian sitting in front of you or a tech or another vet in that practice. I promise you, if you give them the time and the patience, they'll explain what they're doing and the importance of it.
Love it. So you said you had one more thing you wanted to say before we sign off.
I want to put y'all through the test of picking out some notes of this bourbon.
Love it. Do I need some more?
One of my favorites. Y'all refill there. So for the listeners, what I brought, one of my favorites is Baker's 7-year single barrel bourbon. Like I said, it's a 7-year age statement, which all that means is it's a minimum of 7 years. This bottle is actually 8 years, 2 months old from coming out of the barrel. Baker's is neat because it's one of the original small batch bourbons. Even though it's classified as a single barrel now, it was originally small batch. And Jim Beam created small batch whiskey. The original Jim Beam small batch collection is Baker's, Booker's, Basil Hayden's, and Knob Creek. Basil Hayden's, Knob Creek, much better known names because they're easily accessible, less expensive. Booker's and Baker's, higher proof, a little stronger, harder to get, but a lot more well-respected, kind of deep into whiskey circles. So when I do tastings, the first thing we do is doing a nose here. And I get past the ethanol really quick, but ethanol is usually what everybody runs into, especially if it's over like 100 proof. This is 107 proof. It's not super, super high. but there's some ethanol there. And when we taste this bourbon, what I want you to do is when you pull it into your mouth, I want you to exhale through your nose at the same time. Especially when you swallow, you exhale immediately, and that gets rid of that ethanol abundance that's sitting there. But just off the nose, is there anything? And I have some notes over here. Is there anything that jumps out at you?
I'm getting kind of vanilla and like maybe an oaky smell.
Both are in there.
That's mainly what I'm picking up.
To me, there's one really distinct note right off the front, and maybe I'm drinking it neat.
I think the rocks are throwing it a little bit.
Peanuts.
We're in Georgia. Love that.
It's got a nutty flavor to it, and scent to it. To me, it's specifically peanuts. And the interesting thing is the big brother, the Booker's, it's like 130 proof, significantly hotter. But it's like opening up a bag of old peanuts. That's the bean thing. Like you can find a nutty flavor in pretty much all bean product. You said vanilla. There's some oak in there.
When you do the nose, when you exhale through your nose while you're taking a sip, you can definitely tell a difference.
Yeah, so
that is the coolest thing.
It's the first thing I tell everybody when we're doing that. That will change your perception.
Definitely a richer flavor when you do that.
Yeah, so let's
tell the difference.
Let's take a taste. And what I do here is I'm not gargling this bourbon or anything like that.
I've heard people do like that. They like brush it between their teeth like a.
I'll do that.
Okay, so that's acceptable.
I kind of do a light swish side to side, let it sit on the tongue for a minute, and then swallow it down.
Oh yeah, you can definitely tell the difference there.
Now we're going to start with layers.
Oh my God.
This is going to start really oaky, like really oaky.
Yeah.
Then you kind of move into this vanilla phase after that. In the middle, kind of where I'm at right now, it's very leather heavy. Y'all get any leather? So when I talk leather, and they're like, how do you know what leather tastes like then? I don't. But I know what it smells like. So to me, this is like a new car or like a leather bomber jacket. Not old, but new. It's got that new kind of leather smell to it. There's a little bit of tobacco mixed in with that. And when I say tobacco, I'm not talking about going to chew up a Marlboro Light. I'm talking this raisiny tobacco leaf flavor. If you've ever chewed like straight chewing tobacco, like old Red Man. It's got like this raisiny flavor to it. And you get a little bit of that here. On the very close of this, and the close is something I pay attention to almost more than anything, is the lingering flavors. Do y'all have any residual flavors hanging out?
It's tough to say. I mean, when you kind of go through some of these things, it like starts to like, I don't know, your mind connects it.
Yeah.
But it's hard to, as an amateur, a novice, such as myself.
Sitting on my tongue.
There's some baking spice. This has rye in it. So it's spicy. That's kind of that black pepper, baking spice, cinnamon, caramel lingering in there. To me, that dissipates pretty quickly, and I'm left with what it started with, which is just a really strong, mature oak. It just sits there for quite a while. So, for the two of y'all and listeners at home, if you want to start picking out flavors, at first you cheat and you just go look them up. Yeah, so there's all these websites that do just this, or go to Finder Sips, and I have tasting notes on all of my reviews. Go read them, and then find that bourbon, pour it, drink it, and literally just sit there and try to pick out flavors. It takes a long time, and it doesn't happen all at once. But my new thing is to pick out like this, just a bizarre like snack food or something like that I can find something in there. And for me on this, I have a little sweetness. It's a fairly high corn. There's some vanilla in there. It's almost like a creme brulee type of deal to me. That sits on the palate a little bit. So I would say creme brulee would be my kind of wild find in this one. I can remember I had Will Benedetto, who's like he used to be the guy in Manhattan for all bars. He's this mixologist, won a bunch of awards. I had him on, and we did George T. Stagg, which is like a pappy. Yeah, you don't find them out there. He had a bottle, I had a bottle, and we did it. And he was the first person to bring that up. He said, "Hey, what's the bizarre food that this tastes like?" I don't know, Will. I mean, hot dogs, I don't know. And he said strawberry Pop-Tarts. And I sat on that forever. And I hate Pop-Tarts, but I ate like 10 strawberry Pop-Tarts. And I finally but that's, to me, that's the fun of bourbon. I think it's a cool thing to sit and enjoy and do some meditation. You know, my bourbon time at night is, I usually take an hour by myself on the back porch. No technology, no TV. I'm just thinking about my day, what I have to do, what I have done. I'm enjoying that with the bourbon to relax me. And during that, I dissect kind of what I'm drinking while I'm dissecting my day.
That's awesome. I mean, this has been fantastic. Guest today, Ben Pate at Lakefield. I think we'd go ahead and just let everybody know. I mean, we're hoping to do a bourbon tasting here. I mean, it'd be great if you could come, and I think there's ways we could all work together in making that happen. So if you're a listener and you enjoyed what we talked about today, don't worry. We're going to have another opportunity to maybe do this all together in person, hopefully here in the next couple months. Awesome. Well, this has been the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks again for tuning in to the Vet Worthwhile podcast. You can find us online at signaturefd.com/signatureveterinary. And then our ask would be, if you found this episode valuable, just think of one friend or colleague that you think would enjoy the content, and just please share. So thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Travis York is the owner of 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and a partner of Signature FD. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors is a veterinary consulting and strategic planning firm of which Signature FD has no involvement or ownership. James Yost is a partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD. Signature FD is an investment advisor registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and Signature FD are not affiliated. Mr. York provides all non-investment advisory services through 3-in-1 Vet Advisors. The opinions of the guests and the contents of this podcast are intended to be educational only and should not be relied upon as investment, tax, business, or planning advice.